Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Swirsky. I'm the campaigns coordinator at the Centenary Action Group. We're a cross-party coalition of organisations and activists campaigning to remove the barriers to women's representation. Before I introduce our panel, I'd just like to introduce our BSL interpreter, Kwan Parry. Thank you. We've had a few tech issues with transcription, which I'm really sorry about. So we're trying to get that sorted, but we will also make sure that there will be closed captions on the video we upload to YouTube, and we'll email that round as well. So we are really pleased to be holding this event today as part of the Labour Party's National Annual Women's Conference. We're going to be discussing how we can bring Parliament to the 21st century and ensure that women in all our diversity are considered, included and valued. As I'm sure you all know, women are still vastly underrepresented in elected politics. And even though within the Labour Party, there is equal number of men and women MPs, actually a few more women MPs, but overall, women make up only 34% of MPs in Parliament and less than a quarter of cabinet members. Black and minoritized women, disabled women, and those with care responsibilities continue to experience further barriers to political representation, even once elected. So this event comes at a really crucial time in Parliament's thinking. Virtual measures in Parliament have been extended until summer recess, but they're due to be scrapped then. And we've certainly seen the virtual participation in Parliament has made politics a lot more accessible and family friendly. And Parliament has shown that it can adapt and should adapt for the 21st century so that it can reflect the society that it serves. Earlier this year, Centenary Action Group published a report, which was by Dr. Jess Smith and Professor Sarah Childs, entitled The Remotely Representative House. And I'll post a link to that in the chat in a second. The report argues that technology could enable politics to be more representative of our society, and it sets out 21 recommendations for change. So I'm really excited to introduce our panel of speakers who will talk about how and why we should modernise Parliament. We have Cathy Boyle and Olga Fitzroy here, and Thangam Debbonaire MP will be joining us in a little bit after business questions in Parliament. As we go along, please use the chat box to share your thoughts, resources, ideas, and also questions. Please do be aware that we may read out your comments or questions and that we are recording. If you'd like to tweet during the event, please tag @Centenary Action and the hashtag is Modernising Parliament. So I'm going to first go over to Cathy Boyle. Cathy is a disability activist and mental health first aid instructor. Cathy is the chair of the Suffolk Coalition of Disabled People and co-chair of Disability Labour, which campaigns to achieve full civil rights for disabled people and to provide a platform for disabled people in the Labour Party. Over to you, Cathy.
Thanks, Anna. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It is so critical, I think, that we're having discussions like this now. As you said, it's a perfect opportunity to be discussing them. And it's absolutely critical to maintain the amount of participation. There's always been a sort of unwritten rule by employers and others that we can't open up work for people who are actually disabled, and functionally for women who have caring responsibilities and carers in general. I've seen a huge uptake in the amount of people that I am speaking to who, like us, are really worried about the repeal of the participation legislation. I was a counselor for 8 years, and I was almost glad I stepped down to do other things on a national level, because now councils are being told that they have to come in and participate Now, fundamentally, that is just the wrong way. I often say the cat's been let out of the bag, and I don't think that cat will go back into the bag as easily. Uh, it's almost as though we suddenly found out that people can participate across the parliamentary floor or across the world, and we're so much more connected. As far as disability is concerned, it makes it possible for entities like councils and parliament to be more representative. You know, they represent more people that um, cover a range of difficulties in face-to-face participation, and especially those who have um, immune systems that are compromised. Specifically, if we're talking about Parliament, it's a nightmare to navigate mobility-wise, and it's just not fit for purpose in order for people who have energy impairment, for instance, to be able to participate. And it also doesn't allow um, for any kind of interaction with people who are just in everyday walks of life. The other thing is, if you look at it, the instances of being locked out can be financial. They can be because they're rearing their families, and that and disability. I mean, all of those factors. And when you start looking at protected characteristics, it's women have made have made larger strides. But when you start thinking about people who have multiple protected characteristics, you start to see the real disadvantages. And with the reports that are coming out now that are saying that there are 2 million people who may be dealing with long COVID is going to just skyrocket. I mean, we have been aware that it's 1/5 of the population that's disabled. And we're going to find, because we've gone a year, and if it's had a substantial impact on somebody's day-to-day life, they will qualify as disabled people. And we're looking at people, the last full number was 13.9 million people in the UK are disabled. That's 1 in 5, approaching on 1 in 4 people in the UK who have a disability. So I think we really have to do whatever we can across party to make sure that this valuable tool that we now have doesn't get turned around, because disabled people for the first time in our lives feel connected to communities, and to just shut that off. Um, there's a whole thing around loneliness as well. It's not, it shouldn't be something we turn on and off. If we truly want to have people who are truly representing their communities, then we have to maintain this level of communication. And I think the last big thing I'll say about it, I often say, everybody who's listening to this broadcast, everybody in the chamber, everybody across the world. You are one illness and one injury from being like me, being disabled. And if you think of that, the COVID has been the perfect representation. It is not a respecter of anybody. And we have the real chance to do something phenomenal for women, but also for disabled people.
Thanks, Kathy. Thank you, Olga. I'm sure everyone else on here, really valued your contribution and the points you're making here around, not wanting to just go back to how things were before. We're going to go to Olga next, and then we'll ask some questions. So please do post them in the chat. I'm going to introduce our second speaker, Olga Fitzroy, who is a campaigner, founder of Parental Pay Equality, and works on policy and public affairs at Pregnant Then Screwed, which is a brilliant organisation and one of our members. In 2019, Olga stood as the Labour Party candidate in Croydon South, and in 2018, Olga was recognised on BBC Women's Hour Power List for her campaign for shared parental leave and for self-employed and freelance staff. So, Olga, over to you.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks, Kathy, for your contribution. That was really powerful and completely kind of chimes with what we feel in terms of maternity discrimination as well. I think there's a lot of crossover on increased participation. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Hannah. I am a campaigner on maternity rights, and I sit on the campaigns and policy board for the charity Pregnant Then Screwed. And our work covers a whole range of topics, from workplace maternity discrimination, anything to do with childcare, whether it's early years or wraparound childcare, because that obviously massively impacts women's ability to work, and any other area where women are disadvantaged by simply daring to procreate. Now, what has this got to do with getting more women into Parliament? Well, first of all, I think everyone on this call would agree that if everybody is equal, they should be equally represented, not just in terms of sex, but also in terms of disability and ethnicity and LGBT, so many protected characteristics and intersectionality as well. So I think it's incredibly important that our Parliament looks like our country, and currently it does not. So I think we all agree, like, in terms of values, that's really important, but it has much bigger practical implications for all of us. And that's what I'm going to talk about a bit from the perspective of women with caring responsibilities, but I think a lot of it probably applies to other protected characteristics as well. We need diverse decision makers to spot the things that perhaps other people might not spot. If we have a group of very privileged white men, or just a certain group with a similar experience, they don't need to be white, but a certain experience, they will have groupthink. They will make similar decisions. They will look after the interests of the people that they have lived experience of, and they will miss things. So we've got some really obvious examples of this that have happened during the pandemic. The first one was when they introduced the SEISS, the SACE scheme, a week after lockdown. It was designed to support self-employed people. Obviously, it didn't cover all self-employed people, but for those that it did, for sole traders, it seemed on the surface like quite a good scheme. It was a 80% income replacement based on a 3-year average of earnings. The minute that criteria was announced, I knew there would be a problem for any woman who had taken maternity leave in the past 3 years. And we estimated that that would be around 70,000 women, give or take, that would be affected. And for any woman that had taken, say, a year off to care for their baby, they would receive 1/3 less support. If they'd had 2 children in that 3-year period, they would receive 60% less support. Obviously, that was a huge problem, and we wrote to the Chancellor hoping that it was an oversight caused by groupthink. We also wrote to Labour MPs. Ellie Reeves raised a question in the House of Commons about this, and the Chancellor responded by saying that people could have periods of absence for all sorts of reasons, and that it was like having a holiday. Now, anyone that's been on maternity leave would realise that being on holiday and maternity leave are completely different. It was also quite important because self-employed men and same-sex parents who are not the birth parent were also excluded because they cannot take maternity allowance. Only the birth mother can claim maternity allowance for self-employed people. So it was really birth mothers who were disadvantaged by this. We then saw no other option but to seek legal advice, and we ended up taking the government to court with the support of some of the trade unions that support freelancers. And we have our appeal hearing next week. Now, this is just an illustration as to why we need diverse representation in Parliament. There's been so many other decisions throughout this pandemic, and there have been lots of decisions full stop, but so many that have failed to consider women, have failed to consider disabled people, have failed to consider people from ethnic minority backgrounds. We found that you could go to the pub before the schools were reopened. We found there was no right to furlough for childcare reasons. And the length of time it took for us to campaign to get low-income parents to be included in the self-isolation grant was about a year. So these are the general reasons why we think it's important to have diverse representation in politics. Now, what are the barriers? I think Kathy's already mentioned a lot of them, particularly also the physical barriers in Parliament. I'm going to talk a little bit about the barriers that you face before you get to becoming an MP or even a councillor. Now, we all know that political activism requires time, and for those that have other responsibilities, if you need to delegate those, that also costs money. Time and money are something that women have less of than men. Women have 5 hours less every week of free time than men do, and that's before COVID and school closures and all the rest of it. Less time to engage in local politics can also mean less strong networks and engagement with those who might influence career. I think we all know that politics is often based on networks, on patronage, and if you don't have the time and resources to put into building those networks, you're instantly at a disadvantage. Now, I know from personal experience that Labour Women's Network has some amazing training courses, which don't just teach you about process, but connect you to women that become your network and your cheerleaders. So if there's women on this call that are interested in the LWN training courses, I would highly recommend them. I was lucky enough to do the Joe Cox Women in Leadership programme, and I'm still in touch with those women today, and they've been an incredible support for anything, not just political activism, but it's just wonderful to have that group of women there. So I would really recommend getting on one of the LWN training courses. We also ran an event called Pregnant Then Elected. This was back in the old days where it was in person. We made sure it was an accessible event. It was a cross-party event, and we were overwhelmed with the response and the amount of women that attended and that expressed an appetite for having more such events. It's something we're definitely looking into repeating in the future. So basically, all the areas that we campaign on: well-paid paternity leave, access to justice for women forced out of work for pregnancy discrimination. But I think the same applies: access to justice for anybody who's discriminated against in the workplace. All these things are vital in enabling women to stand in politics. If you have less discrimination, if you have more participation in the workplace, if you have more equal distribution of labour inside the home, you're freeing up people's time and you're giving them resources and money with which to stand for elected office. But what happens when they get there? I know Kathy's already raised some really important points about accessibility, but there's also, I think, a huge missed opportunity for Parliament. In my view, the place that sets employment law should be a model workplace that employers look up to. It should be an example of best practice. But sadly, I think it falls far, far short. And I think if we look at some of the individual instances that have happened in Parliament, if they were employers imposing these procedures on their employees, they would be taken to tribunal and they would lose. One of the big leaps that we've made in recent times, and I had to look this up, it was only in 2019, we brought in proxy voting in Parliament. And it only happened because Tulip Siddiq delayed the birth of her child. And that is what shamed the government into action and bringing in proxy voting. Can you imagine it? And we had the scenes where we've had other MPs brought into the chamber in a wheelchair in order to vote. Again, an employer would find themselves at a tribunal if they try to force employees into the workplace in that state. But we got there with proxy voting, but we still have so much further to go with parental leave. Now, maternity leave does not exist for MPs. They're not employees, they're elected officials. So a lot of those employment laws don't apply. But again, like I said about Parliament being a model for employment, why do they not apply those same rules? So at the moment, the rules on maternity leave are that the MP can apply to IPSA, the pay body, to get some funding to cover a member of staff to cover their absence. That seems fairly reasonable, but it's the fact that the MPs have to apply and that the funding is at the discretion of a pay body. There is no maternity leave policy for MPs, or there's no paternity leave policy for MPs. And again, having the staff member to cover the MP's job, still that staff member can't legally do some of the things that MPs do. They cannot speak in the chamber, they cannot ask questions or participate in debates. And these aren't things that can just be done really quickly. I think they do need consideration because they have constitutional impacts. But the point is, Parliament has not considered them. It has not been a priority of the government to figure out how to make these quite complicated things actually work. Workplaces, when they're confronted with a new issue or an issue that has suddenly come to the light, if it's a good workplace, they will sit and they will consider it and they will try and make it work and figure out a way to make it work. But Parliament seems to be lagging very far behind. Another area that I think is mentioned in the CAG report is job shares. They are not currently allowed in Parliament. Again, it's not simple constitutionally, but it is something that has, again, not yet been considered. I was on a call with CAG, I think it was before Christmas, where I was speaking to a Welsh Assembly member who actually chose to give up her job because she was not allowed to do a job share. And so we've lost a talented woman from politics because of procedure, because a workplace is not considered and found a way to make job shares work. I mean, like all the people in Parliament, they're meant to be running the country and they can't figure out job shares or access or maternity leave. It's not a lack of ability, it's a lack of political will. And I think I'm going to leave it there, so I haven't really answered any questions, but I hope I've sort of shone a bit of a light on where we are at the moment and why we need change.
Thank you, Olga. No, that was brilliant. I think it's so important to highlight how, it's not just an end in and of itself to achieve equal representation. It actually has such important consequences for policy across the board, which impacts everyone in their daily lives. And it's so important that we break down the barriers to ensure that we do have that equal power and equal representation. So Thangam's hopefully going to be joining us in a few minutes. But I wanted to ask both of you a question first. So as mentioned, the Labour Party has achieved equal representation of men and women MPs, but there's clearly so much more to do. So what do you think the Labour Party itself can do to improve women's political participation and representation, and particularly women with intersectional identities? I don't know if either of you want to go first. Kathy?
Yeah, the first thing I would do is make sure that people have equal access to training as well. There are, I think that the training, there's a new training situation that they're going to try to launch. And I think that is going to go a little way to help redress the power imbalance. But what I think is that has to be happening all the way through our daily lives, whether it's politics or anything, or employment or anything like that. I think across the board, we are not going to be representative if we have people who are disadvantaged. And I think as good as the Joe Cox program is, there are other needs specific to other groups as well. So whilst I'm not in any way dissing the Joe Cox program, what I'm saying is that needs to be replicated in order for everybody to have a chance at it. And people are going to feel more comfortable sometimes in they can pick and choose which groups they want to be represented by, sort of. It opens the door, I think, and that has to go from both the top of the party and the bottom. And we have to be moving towards meeting, because I think it's just, it's not that I'm saying that it's criminal in any other way than a lot of the things that happen are against the tenets of things like the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, for instance. So that would be what I would say. I'm gonna be quiet. I'm happy for somebody to write down questions, and I'll respond then. But since Thangam is here, well,
Yeah.
yes, she is here. I'll let her sort herself out. But I think that it is also getting allies from the people who actually do currently make the decisions, and they need to not just nod and say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. They need to put their money where their mouth is and make changes within this party. So, and others, but specifically, Labor needs to be putting forward labor values, and that means labor values for everybody, not just people who can afford it.
Thank you, Kathy. And I've also seen a comment in the chat about caring responsibilities, and totally agree. You know, it's caring responsibilities not just in terms of childcare, across the board. And I think one of the really strong examples in Parliament during the first lockdown, was a Lib Dem MP in Scotland, Jamie Stone, who's a carer for his wife, and he was highlighting how, you know, he couldn't leave and come down. He needed to be there caring for his wife, and also ensuring that he wasn't putting her at risk as she was shielding. And so, yeah, a really important point to make. Caring responsibilities, so many different forms. Sorry,
just also the conference settings. When we have our full conference, we have to accept that carers have to be able to bring the people that they care for with them to conference, and that they shouldn't be eliminated from speaking at conference. And conference has to allow for people to also represent their ideas in the hall when we're making policy changes. And there's not enough disability stuff, because that's what I'm talking about basically. There's not enough commitment to changing things for disabled people and those who have intersectionality issues across the other protected characteristics. We've got there with a safe room, and we've got there with a prayer space, but there's so much further to go.
Yeah, no, thank you. Fab, I'm going to go over to Thangam now. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate that you've got a very busy schedule and managed to get this in. So Thangam Debbonaire is the Labour MP for Bristol West, where I used to live, so I'm slightly biased. But she was recently appointed Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, and previously served as the Shadow Secretary of State for Housing. Since her election in 2015, Thangam has worked on a range of issues relating to gender equality, including domestic violence and refugee rights. Thangam, over to you.
Hi, and thank you so much for having me and being so tolerant of me turning up just like this. I'm so sorry, because I always feel bad when someone says we know how busy you are, because everybody's busy. It's just the busyness in Parliament, it just makes things slightly unpredictable sometimes. At least today I knew that it would be unpredictable, so it was predictable unpredictability. I was in the chamber all morning, and I looked around and I thought, it's very interesting what I see. So at one point we were in the trade debate, and almost everyone on our side was female, including the Shadow Secretary of State, Emily Thornberry. And almost everyone on the other side was male, with the exception of the actual Secretary of State, Liz Truss. So I did a quick check, and things have moved since I was elected. When I was elected, I was the 408th woman ever. Now it may sound better than it is, it's terrible. There were more men in Parliament at that point than the total number of women who had ever been elected ever at that point. It was a fifth of Parliament then was female, and it's now a third. So there has been progress, but the progress has mostly been on our side and mostly in the Labour Party. We've driven it. We've driven it both in terms of the numbers and in terms of the example that it sets. So just a quick update on where we are now. In the Parliamentary Labour Party, total number of Labour MPs, 198, and small cheer for the fact that we're now in the majority, we are 102. So that's 51%. Don't let it mean that we give up on all women shortlists, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. That shouldn't mean that we go, right, job done. Also in Shadow, that compares, with the Tory party. There are, very sadly, 363 of them, and 87 are women. So that's fewer in number and in proportion. It's only 24%. So a quarter of the Parliamentary Tory party is female, and a half of the Parliamentary Labour Party is female. Just under half of all the women MPs are Labour MPs. So we're the ones making the data look good, and we're the ones, I think, showing up an example. We then compare cabinet to shadow cabinet. There are 23 people in cabinet, that's Prime Minister and co. Of them, only 5 are women. Whereas in shadow cabinet, we've got a slightly bigger shadow cabinet. Keir appointed people, for instance, to Shadow Housing Secretary, which I was before I'm this, as a full cabinet post, which it isn't in actual cabinet, but I think that shows just how important Keir recognises housing is. Anyway, we have 34 people, of whom 18 are women. So again, we're in the majority, 53%. And I think the thing that hurts a lot of us, and I think I came in just as you were chatting about this, is that in the entire history of the Labour Party, despite the fact that we've always been the party that's pushed on women's equality, that have pushed on getting more women into Parliament, have had to fight against our own side very often, going way, way, way back, right to the beginning of the party. I can talk forever about what happened when a group of Cooperative Women's Guild campaigners came and watched a load of Labour MPs in 1913 argue against maternity payment going to women, and how it galvanised them into saying, well, we can't be spectators, we're going to have to get ourselves elected. So, you know, we've been the party pushing, and often in spite of our own side as well as other people. However, we've never elected a woman as leader. We have actually had women leaders, but only as interims. I think it's quite telling that just happens over and over again. I think it replicates something that used to happen before we had all women shortlists. If all you ever see are men as MPs, your mental image of an MP is a man. And that's why we needed all women shortlists, because even though if you scratch any Labour member, they'd almost all say to you, I believe in equality. And yet over and over and over again, until we had all women shortlists, members would overwhelmingly keep selecting as their candidates for Parliament people who looked like the others, i.e. men. So we came up with all women shortlists, and that's helped, but it's been a battle and we need to defend it, because without it we will lose candidates. We will. I'm absolutely confident of that. And that's not because I think members of the Labour Party are inherently sexist. I think it's just that when you're dealing with a dominant image of MP as male, and it still is, that's what people will select more often than not every time. And the same is true of the leader. If you have in your head an image of what the Labour leader looks like, it's always male, and that's because it almost always has been. So that's what's in people's heads. Now, that's no disrespect to any of the fantastic men who have been leaders of the Labour Party. I serve at the pleasure of the Labour Party, and I serve the leader, whoever they are. I was a whip to Jeremy Corbyn for 3.5 years. I was a candidate under Ed Miliband. I campaigned for Keir Starmer, and I've served him in his shadow cabinet. I don't think there is any Labour leader at all, ever, that is ever, every Labour leader is always going to be better than every Tory leader. So I'm always going to support whoever is in charge of the Labour Party. But I do think it's time that we changed our mental image of what a Labour leader looks like. I'd quite like everyone to put up pictures every time they have one of these talks or talk about leaders. I'd like us to put up pictures of Margaret Beckett and Harriet Harman, who have been leaders of the Labour Party. I want you to put them up. So every time you're giving a talk on how to encourage more women to get into Parliament, put up pictures of Harriet and Margaret. They've been leader too. And I think that's really important. No, so what's helped us to get to 50-50? Selection of candidates. And I've written underneath there, all women shortlist, all women shortlist, all women shortlist, over and over again. I was selected by all women shortlist. And there were people, they were men, who said, oh, wouldn't you rather be selected on your own merits? Which I just thought was astonishing and proving the point. I was selected on my own merits against 3 other very, very talented women. We were all selected on our merits. Any one of us would have made a great MP, in my view. And it really proved the point for me of why we need all women shortlists when there's so many people who were prepared to say that, as if I couldn't have held my own against a bloke. I easily could, but I would have been better than most of the blokes that have been put up for that seat. I'm only guessing. Gosh, this is being recorded, isn't it? Let's make that a bit more hypothetical. If I had been better than any of the blokes, I would have still been odds against winning, because people's mental image would still have been a bloke. Okay? Doesn't mean I couldn't have won. I might have done. Other women do win on open selection, but it's a lot tougher because of that mental image thing. So, I think also a couple of things that are very niche and administrative, but they do make a difference. The hours when Harriet Harman first came to Parliament, whilst pregnant and then subsequently gave birth in her first year, were atrocious. They did not make for good government. They made for government by people who'd been in and out of a bar because it was 3 o'clock in the morning. They made for government and opposition by very tired people because it was 4 o'clock in the morning. They made Parliament a club which benefited those people who had an extra professional job that they could fit in between the hours of sort of 10 and 1, i.e. some of the professions, some lawyers, some accountants, some people who were able to, so i.e. not Labour MPs typically, not typically Labour MPs. They didn't work for anyone who had a family. And in those days, you couldn't even bring a baby that you were breastfeeding through the voting lobbies. You had to hand them to someone else while you walk through the lobby and then come out the other side. Ridiculous. Because there's a rule that says only members can go through voting lobbies, like a baby can vote. It's ridiculous. That's changed. So that's something I wanted to let people know about. This has changed. The hours have changed. So too has the ridiculous rule about you can't bring your baby through the voting lobby. Loads of colleagues have done that now. And I'm really pleased about that. So that gets around. Lots of women in my intake have had babies since becoming MPs. Lots of the men in my intake have had babies since becoming MPs and have brought them to work, have made use of the fact we now have on-site childcare. Jean Corsten, when I interviewed her, told me about how back in the 80s, she and another woman MP went to measure up what was then, can you believe it, a shooting range. You could literally shoot for fun on the state of the House of Commons, but you couldn't have a baby in childcare. So to wind the men up who were there, they started measuring the place up and calling out to each other, going, how many cots do you think we could fit in here? In the end, that shooting range, by the way, is no longer here, or if it is, I've never found it, but we do now have on-site childcare. It's in the site of a former bar, and I occasionally still hear some members moaning that it's not a bar anymore, like we don't actually have enough bars. I don't think really we need any, but that makes me very unpopular with my colleagues, so I'm going to just let that one sit. We needed childcare more than we needed a bar, and it matters not just for MPs, but for MP staff. Because for everything that makes Parliament inaccessible for women as MPs, it also is replicated for staff who are less well paid, so have less flexibility. So we have on-site creche. Also, if you are a member of Parliament, no one's going to tell you this, by the way, but if you're thinking of standing for Parliament and you're thinking, but how would I manage my family life? You actually get, as part of your expenses, you get an accommodation allowance. It is capped, it's not unlimited, but I get much less than anyone who has children under the age of 18. The amount they get is enough, or in theory, it's enough to pay for accommodation that's bigger so that people can have their families living with them during the week. Lots of colleagues do. There are other colleagues who haven't wanted to do that, whose families, whose children are back in their home constituency. I have mixed feelings about this because actually we work still very long hours, even with the reform of the hours. It's a responsible job. I'm not convinced we could ever make it not long hours. I think it's better that it's not all night, but I actually think there's a lot to do. And if you are relentlessly devoted to public service, the emails never stop, the requests never stop. The amount of work you could do to campaign on behalf of your constituents is endless. It is infinite. And I think we don't have set hours for our work. We have set hours when Parliament sits, but I work way beyond them, not because anyone's making me, but because I want to do as good a job as I can for my constituents. And I know plenty of MPs who are parents, including parents of young children, who are also very proud to do the same. They're not hiding it, but sometimes there are practical difficulties, particularly for single parents. Slightly easier for London MPs than for non-London MPs. But as I said, the accommodation allowance makes some allowance for that. So what makes it difficult? Things that women tell me that put them off from standing are social media, exposure generally, and threats in particular. Now I'm very conflicted about whenever I'm asked about these, because I don't want to put women off standing. My tactic with social media is I have muted and blocked so many people. I don't need to see people being abusive towards me on my timeline, so I mute and block. I'm fairly sparing about the block, but I'm pretty relentless about the mute. If I don't want to hear someone being abusive, especially if they're not a constituent. Now, if they are a constituent, I might say, why don't we have a chat? And you'll be amazed how disarming that actually is. But if they're not a constituent and they're abusive to me on my timeline, I'm not interested. I'm just going to mute them or block them. Threats. This is a hard time of year and it's a hard occasion because Jo was murdered 5 years ago, 2 weeks ago, and that's very hard for those of us who were her friends and came in with her. And I don't think I'm ever going to forget hearing the terror in my mum's voice when she told me about how she felt when she'd misheard that an MP had been killed in what she thought was Bristol, but was actually Birstall. And every MP's family, I think particularly those of us who are with Jo, knows how our families felt. I mean, it's indescribable. It was actually, I think, much harder for them than for us, because we just get on with it. We've got things to do. Our families worry about us, and that's hard to take. Knowing that my husband is worried about me, knowing that my mom is worried about me, that's quite hard to take, and I think that puts off some women. And I have to admit, that is one that I do struggle with. I don't want my family to have to worry about me going to work. I think the fact that, like many jobs, there are plenty of jobs like this. It is a job with long hours and working away from home for most, not all of us. And I think that's tough. And I think that's something we're going to have a discussion about. That. Could democracy change? I'm not sure that it would ever change to the point where a dedicated member of parliament didn't want to keep working. If they were working on something that they knew could help a constituent, most MPs of most parties will keep going until they've got a resolution for their constituent, or until they've worked out a way of fixing it. And I'm not sure I know a way of limiting that sense of duty, which I do see in members of parliament from all parties. Not every member of parliament, but I do see it in MPs of all parties. So I'm not sure how we'd limit that. But I do think there are then other difficulties that are practical difficulties for women who are pregnant or about to have a small baby, and the practicalities of that. Now, there actually are ways through that, but I can understand that for women who are thinking about whether or not to stand, that can be off-putting. Anyone who is thinking of it, by the way, talk to us, talk to people in the Women's PLP, in the Women's Parliamentary Labour Party, talk to us about those who've had babies while serving. That doesn't include me. Talk to them. There's a range of experiences. They don't all agree. And there's the misogyny and sexism, which again is part of just public life for women in many professions, not just being a parliamentarian. And what's the good news? We have the Labour Women's Network. We have Fabian Women's Network. They both run fantastic mentoring and training schemes. I recommend them most heartily. I went on the Labour Women's Network residential weekends 7-8 years ago. It helped me decide that I wanted to put myself forward as a candidate. It also helped other brilliant women who I still know and count as colleagues to decide not to. And it's a good way of sifting through, is this really for me? The Women's Parliamentary Labour Party, we are a resource. And I think that, anyone who's thinking about how can I make a difference, talk to us. We love coming to talk to members. We love going out to CLPs. We love the fact that Zoom, whilst we hate quite a lot of things about it, it does at least mean that we can visit CLPs and women's CLPs around the country. I would love to visit more. We have union women's groups and networks. We have all women's shortlists. But I think there's a lot more we could do. I want to finish on this. I think one of the things we can do for each other is support each other, even if we disagree on things. And I've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, unfortunately, some of the antagonism between politicians has been people on our own side, thinking it was more important to disagree with each other publicly than sort things out respectfully, one-to-one. Personally, I think that's unhelpful, especially when it's between women. I think that makes a lot of other women feel put off, because they think, well, where would I get my support if not from other Labour women? And I still get some of that, but I've got a support network. I think making Parliament more accessible generally, and it's far from accessible. So in my role as Shadow Leader of the House, part of my job is to help oversee the restoration and renewal of Parliament, which is going to happen. It has to happen, and it has to result in Parliament being more accessible, not just for me as an MP, but for staff and for the public. And that's something else I want to finish on, is encourage people to come and see us. Come visit. Everyone on this call, please do come and visit. We can't have visitors at the moment because of COVID regs, but they won't last forever. And when they do, please come and visit. If ever you're in London, contact your MP if you've got a Labour MP, or contact one of us if not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thangam. So much covered, brilliant. And yeah, just been going through some of the comments as well on this. I'm really conscious of time and that there's another event on the Fringe programme. So I don't think we'll have time to take further questions. But I just want to thank you all so much for contributing to this and the real kind of breadth of what we've discussed today in terms of what needs to change and why we need representation. Before we go, I just want to, we've mentioned a few of the specific Labour Party training, and I also want to just promote equal power, which is non-partisan online training for women on getting into politics, community activism, using your voice online, and I'll post a link to the chat in the chat on that as well, because there are lots of great free sessions too. But you know, we know that a lot of these structural barriers, that's not going to solve everything, but you know, it's one way to help. And so yeah, I'll just finish there. Thank you so much, Kathy, Olga and Thangam, and to Kwan as well for interpreting. And I hope you all have a good rest of the day. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.